The first time Elara Holt saw the man hauling 50 apple saplings up the face of a mountain in the dead of a Colorado winter, she thought he had lost his mind entirely. The year was 1873, and the town of Ridgecrest sat at the foot of the San Juan Mountains like a coin someone had dropped and forgotten, small enough that everyone knew the name of everyone else's horse, and large enough to have 2 saloons, a general store, a schoolhouse, and one very stubborn postmaster who refused to deliver mail on Sundays, no matter who was dying. The town had been carved out of wild land by people with rough hands and rougher dreams, and it held onto its residents the way the mountains held onto their snow, with a quiet, immovable kind of permanence. Elara had come to Ridgecrest 2 years before, following her Uncle Jonas after her parents died of typhoid fever on the road out of Missouri. She was 22 years old, dark-haired, and possessed of a sharp intelligence that most men in town mistook for stubbornness. She ran her Uncle Jonas's dry goods store 3 days a week, helped the schoolteacher, Mrs. Farnsworth, with reading lessons on Tuesdays, and on every other evening without fail, she baked. Bread, mostly, because flour and salt were cheap and plentiful, but what she loved most, what she dreamed about with an ache that felt almost embarrassing in its intensity, was apple pie. Her mother had taught her the recipe, pressing the lard into the flour with practiced hands while Elara watched, and the smell of cinnamon and brown sugar bubbling under a golden crust was the closest thing to home that she could still reach. The problem was that apples were nearly impossible to come by in Ridgecrest. The town sat at close to 8,000 feet of elevation, and while the summers were brilliant and short and the winters were long and punishing, there had never been a successful apple tree within 30 miles of the place. When apple season came in the lower valleys, a supply wagon would sometimes bring a bushel or 2 up the mountain road, and Elara would buy every last one of them, bake pies for 3 days straight, and then spend the remaining 11 months of the year remembering what it felt like. She had mentioned this once to her Uncle Jonas while they were sitting on the porch in the amber light of a September evening. "I would give a great deal for a single apple tree," she said. "Just one, even a small one." Jonas had laughed, not unkindly, and told her that apple trees did not grow at 8,000 feet in the San Juan Mountains, and that she would have better luck growing the moon in a clay pot. She had laughed with him, but the longing had not left her. She did not think about that conversation again until the morning in January of 1873, when she stepped out of the dry goods store into a sky white with cold and saw the man on the ridge. He was silhouetted against the pale winter light high above the town, moving along the tree line with something slung across his back. Whatever he was carrying was large and bundled and clearly heavy, because even from where she stood, she could see the deliberate weight of each step he took. She shielded her eyes against the glare. He was enormous, taller than most men by half a head, with shoulders that seemed to fill the sky between 2 pine trees, and long, dark hair that lifted slightly in the mountain wind. He moved with the kind of slow, absolute confidence of a man who has spent years learning exactly what his body was capable of and had never once been surprised by the answer. She watched him for a long moment before old Tom Aldrich came out of the saloon across the street and stopped beside her, following her gaze up the ridge. "That is Cassian Cole," Tom said, in the tone a person uses when they are about to tell you something they consider significant. "He lives up on the north face. Came down to the valley 3 weeks ago and bought every apple sapling he could find from the nurseryman in Durango." Elara kept her eyes on the distant figure. "Apple saplings." 50 of them, so I heard. Paid cash. Nobody knows what he means to do with them." Tom scratched under his hat. "Man's been up on that mountain alone for 4 years, trapping mostly. People say he talks to his horse more than he talks to people." "What does he want with apple trees?" Elara asked. Tom shrugged. "Could not say. But I will tell you this. If he is trying to grow them up here, he is either the most determined man alive or the biggest fool in Colorado, and I am not entirely sure it is not both." Elara watched until the silhouette disappeared into the tree line, and she thought about apple trees growing on the side of a mountain where everyone said they could not grow. And she felt something shift very slightly inside her chest, like a stone that had been sitting in one place so long you forgot it was resting crooked, until suddenly it found its level. She did not see him again for 6 weeks. Winter in Ridgecrest was not a season so much as it was a state of siege. The snow came down out of the mountains in thick curtains that turned the world white and reduced travel to the essential and the desperate. Elara kept the stove in the store, burning from before dawn until after dark, mended her gloves twice, taught reading lessons wrapped in a wool blanket, and thought about apple saplings buried in the frozen ground of a north-facing mountainside. She thought about them the way you think about something that does not quite make sense, turning it over and over without finding the answer, until the wondering itself becomes a kind of companionship. In mid-February, the town got a foot of new snow in a single night, and the road out to the lower valley closed entirely. 3 days later, Cassian Cole came down off the mountain and into the dry goods store, and Elara's life changed in the way that lives change when you are not remotely ready, all at once and without warning, like a door blowing open in the wind. She heard the door before she saw him, because it opened with more force than usual, not roughly, but with the unconscious efficiency of a man unaccustomed to small spaces, and she looked up from the ledger she was updating and found him filling the doorway. He was even larger up close than the silhouette on the ridge had suggested. He stood well over 6 feet, and the sheepskin coat he wore over his shoulders made him look even broader, though she could see even through its bulk that the breadth of his chest and the width of his arms were his own. His hair was dark and fell past his collar, pushed back from a face that was weathered by wind and altitude and 4 years of mountain living, with a jaw set like something carved. Dark eyes that scanned the room with the automatic watchfulness of a man used to being alone in wild places, and a mouth that looked, in its default state, like it had forgotten how to be anything other than straight and serious. He stamped snow off his boots and closed the door behind him, and then stood there for a moment taking in the shelves with a quiet thoroughness, and Elara set down her pen. "Good morning," she said. "What can I get for you?" He looked at her. It was a direct, unhurried look, the kind that assessed without being rude, and she had the odd sensation of being seen rather than merely noticed, which was not a feeling she was used to. "Cordage," he said, "the heaviest you have, and seed packets if you carry them. Whatever is left from the fall." His voice was deep and unhurried, like water moving over stone. "I have cordage," she said, coming around the counter. "Seed packets, we have a few, mostly turnip and carrot, winter squash. What else?" "Cinnamon, whatever quantity you have." He paused. "Brown sugar, if there is any." She stopped walking. "Cinnamon and brown sugar," she repeated. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Yes?" She looked at him for a moment, and then went to the spice shelf and brought down the cinnamon tin. "You are Cassian Cole," she said. "I am," he said, without inflection. "I am Elara Holt. This is my uncle's store." She set the cinnamon on the counter and reached for the brown sugar crock. "Tom Aldrich told me you bought apple saplings in Durango." A pause. "He did he?" "He said 50 of them." 47, Cassian Cole said. 3 did not survive the ride up." Elara measured out the sugar and looked at him again. "Can apple trees grow up here, at this elevation?" He held her gaze steadily. "I intend to find out." She found that she had nothing to say to that, which was unusual. She wrapped the cinnamon in sugar and found his cordage and added a package of turnip seeds that he studied for a moment before setting back on the counter with a small shake of his head. She tallied his total and he paid in coin without ceremony, and he was almost to the door when she said, without really planning to, "What do you want with cinnamon and brown sugar? You do not seem like a man who bakes." He turned around. Those dark eyes found her face again and rested there for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. "I do not," he said. "They are for trading." "Trading for what?" The faintest pause. "Information," he said, and then he opened the door and walked out into the February cold, and Elara stood behind the counter for a good 30 seconds after the door closed before she realized her pen was still on the ledger, and she had been tapping her fingers against the wooden surface without knowing it. She thought about that conversation for days. She could not have explained why. He had been perfectly ordinary in every way that mattered, polite, direct, paid without arguing the price, and yet there was something about his stillness that stayed with her, the way a particular quality of light stays with you after you have stopped looking at it. It was her friend and neighbor, Bess Whitmore, who provided the next piece of the puzzle. Bess was 2 years older than Elara and had married the town's blacksmith and had a baby on her hip and an opinion on everything, and was therefore one of Elara's favorite people in Ridgecrest. "He came to see my husband," Bess told her one afternoon in late February, bouncing the baby on one arm and drinking coffee with the other in the manner of a woman who had perfected the art of doing everything at once. Cassian Cole. He wanted to know about soil and altitude and what kinds of trees had ever grown at that elevation. Robert told him what he knew, which was not much, and Cole stood there listening to every word like it was scripture, and then thanked him and left. "Did Robert say what he thought of him?" Elara asked. "He said he was the most serious man he had ever met, and that he clearly knew more about what he was doing than he let on, because the questions he asked were not the questions of a fool." Bess eyed her over the coffee mug. "Why the interest?" "He came into the store," Elara said. "He bought cinnamon and brown sugar." "Cinnamon and brown sugar," Bess repeated. "And he is growing apple trees on the north face." Bess was quiet for a moment, and then she said very carefully, "Elara, you do not think—" "I think nothing," Elara said firmly. "I am simply noting that the man bought unusual supplies." Bess's smile was slow and knowing and infuriating. "Of course you are." March came and the snow began to ease, and the town emerged from its winter state of siege the way a bear emerges from a cave, slowly, resentfully, but with a gathering relief. The road to the lower valley reopened, and the supply wagons came through, and life expanded again to fill all its ordinary shapes. Cassian Cole came down to the store twice more in March, each time with a specific list in a manner that was businesslike without being cold. He bought more cordage, a good hatchet to replace one whose handle had cracked in the freeze, and on his second visit, a small paper packet of apple seeds that Elara had found tucked in the back of the seed crate while reorganizing the shelves, and set aside without being entirely sure why. When she put them on the counter in front of him, he looked at them for a moment and then at her. "I did not ask for those," he said. "I know," she said. "I thought you might want them anyway. They are not worth much to anyone else up here." He studied her face, and she had the feeling again of being seen rather than just noticed. Then he reached into his coat pocket and put 2 coins on the counter, more than they were worth, and picked up the packet and put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome." She paused. "How are the saplings?" "Alive," he said, and something in the way he said it, quiet and careful, like a man reporting on something fragile that he was responsible for, made her chest do that shifting thing again. "All 47? 44. 3 more did not make it through the hard freeze in January, but the others are holding." "That is remarkable," she said, and she meant it. He looked at her with that steady, dark gaze and then said, "You know about apple trees." "I know about apple pie," she said, "which is not the same thing, but it is adjacent." And then something happened to his face that she would think about for a long time afterward. It was not a smile exactly. It was more like the possibility of one, a slight softening around the eyes and mouth that suggested that somewhere behind all that weathered seriousness, there was a warmth that he did not show often, and she had the strange, electric feeling of having been offered a glimpse of something precious and rare. "That is fair," he said, and picked up his hatchet and left. April in the San Juan Mountains is not spring so much as it is winter, pretending to consider its options. There are days of piercing clarity and thin warmth, and then there are days when another foot of snow falls without apology, and everyone wears their heaviest coat and pretends they do not mind. Elara minded, but had learned not to say so, since minding did not change anything, and Coloradans took an unreasonable pride in their ability to endure weather that no sensible person would voluntarily endure. It was in mid-April that the trouble started. There were 2 men in Ridgecrest who made Elara uneasy, a fact she had noted privately and discussed with no one because there was nothing specific to report, and women who reported vague unease about specific men in small western towns were generally told they were being fanciful. Their names were Del Pruitt and his partner, a narrow, quiet man called Sayers, and they had come to Ridgecrest in the fall with a wagon full of goods they sold from a makeshift stall and then stayed on, renting a room at the smaller saloon and conducting what they described as trading business. What the trading business actually consisted of was something nobody could quite pin down, which was itself suspicious. And Del Pruitt had a way of watching Elara when she was in the store that made her feel like a door being measured for a frame she had not agreed to fit. He came into the store on a Tuesday afternoon when her Uncle Jonas was at the assay office and she was alone, and he stood at the counter and talked for longer than he needed to, and stood closer than was strictly necessary, and asked questions that were pleasant on their surface and had edges underneath, the way some stones look smooth until you pick them up. "Heard you and the mountain man have gotten acquainted," Del said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Elara kept her expression neutral. "I run the store. Most people in town have gotten acquainted." "Sure," Del said. "Sure. Man like that, though, living up there all alone. Wonder what he gets up to." He was looking at her steadily. "Man gets lonely, I suppose." "Is there something I can help you with today?" Elara said. He bought a tin of tobacco he did not need and left, and Elara went to the back of the store and stood very still for a moment and breathed carefully and told herself that she was not frightened, which was only partially true. She did not see Cassian Cole for 10 days after that, and she spent those 10 days in the ordinary business of living and noticed, with irritation at herself for noticing, that she was listening for the particular weight of his step on the board porch outside the store whenever the door opened. What she was feeling was ridiculous, she told herself. She had spoken to the man 4 times. She did not know him. He had bought cinnamon and sugar and a hatchet and apple seeds, and had shown her the almost smile once, and that was all of it. It was nothing. It was the kind of thing you could hold in your hand, and it would weigh nothing at all. She told herself this convincingly enough that she almost believed it until the 5th day, when she caught herself wondering what he ate up there on the mountain and whether he had enough firewood, and at that point she gave up trying to believe it and simply let herself wonder. He came into the store on a Thursday morning when the air had finally turned soft enough to suggest that spring might actually be coming after all, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had been working hard for a long time and was running on something stronger than rest. There were circles under his eyes and a tension in his jaw that had not been there before, and he moved with his usual economy of motion, but there was something underneath it that was tired. She did not say any of this because she did not know him well enough to say it, and so instead she said, "Good morning," and began gathering what she suspected his list would be before he even handed it to her. He watched her do this with an expression she now recognized as his considering expression, the one where he was processing something and had not yet decided what to do with it. "You guessed half of that correctly," he said when she put the pile on the counter. "The other half?" He added 3 items to her pile. She got 2 of them from the shelf behind her without turning around fully, and he looked at her when she came back and said, "How did you know about the lamp oil?" "Because every other time you have come in you have bought it," she said, "and it has been 11 days. There was a pause. She realized what she had said and kept her expression entirely even, as though counting the days between a person's visits was a completely ordinary thing to do. 11 days, he said very carefully. "We keep an inventory log," she said, which was true but not exactly the relevant fact. He held her gaze for a moment and said nothing, which was somehow more eloquent than anything he could have said. Then he paid for his supplies and started for the door, and she heard herself say, "Are the trees all right? With the late cold?" He stopped, turned. "You have been thinking about the trees," he said. "I have been thinking about what grows on the mountain," she said, which was true in a way that was both completely literal and not literal at all. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face did the almost smile thing again, and it was worse this time because it lasted longer. "The trees are all right," he said. 42 of them. They are stubborn little things." "Good," she said, and smiled at him, and his eyes stayed on her face for 2 full seconds before he nodded once and went out the door. She was smiling at the closed door when Bess walked in from the back room where she had been visiting and said, "Well," in a tone that contained an entire lecture. "Do not," Elara said. "I did not say anything," Bess said. "You were about to. I was going to say that he's a very handsome man." "He is," Elara said before she could stop herself. Bess's smile was enormous. "I know," she said. May came with green and wildflowers and warming days, and Elara found reasons to walk up the northern trail twice in the first week of it, on the pretext of gathering early herbs, which she did in fact gather, so it was not a dishonest pretext. She did not see Cassian Cole on either of those walks, and she told herself she had not expected to, which was also mostly true. On the third Sunday of May, she was baking bread at the back of the store. Uncle Jonas allowed this since the smell of it was good for business, and Elara could not bake at the rented room she kept above the milliner's without smoking out the whole building. When she heard the front door open and close, and then she heard Cassian Cole's voice say her uncle's name, and she stood still with flour on her hands and listened. He had come to buy, but there was something else. She could tell from the measured cadences of the conversation, and after a few minutes, she heard Jonas call back to her. "Elara, come out here a moment." She wiped her hands on her apron and came out. Cassian Cole stood at the counter with a hand-drawn map on the wood between him and Jonas, and he looked up when she came in with that direct, unhurried look, and she looked back at him and noticed that his hands, spread on either side of the map, were extraordinary, large and scarred and calloused in the particular ways that came from working with an axe and rope in the bare earth, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that they were the most capable-looking hands she had ever seen. "Cole wants to know about the town's water rights on the north slope," Jonas was saying. "He is putting in irrigation channels." "For the trees," Elara said. Cassian looked at her. "For the trees," he confirmed. Jonas walked them through what he knew of the water rights, which was considerable since he had been in Ridgecrest for 12 years and had served on the town council for 4 of them. And Elara stood beside her uncle and listened and occasionally added something. And once she leaned forward to point to a place on the map where Jonas had the south and north branches of the creek confused, and her arm was very close to Cassian Cole's arm when she did it, and she was aware of his nearness the way you are aware of a fire, not as a specific thought but as a physical fact, warmth and light in the periphery. When they were done, Cassian rolled the map up carefully and tucked it under his arm and said, "Thank you, Jonas." Then he looked at Elara. "And thank you." "You're welcome," she said. He started to leave and then stopped with his hand on the door and turned back. And he had an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was neither his watchfulness nor his almost smile, but something in between, something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, very much like a person gathering their nerve. "Miss Holt," he said, "I wonder if you might be willing to walk up the North Trail on Saturday morning. I would like to show you something." Elara felt the pause before she answered it as a physical thing. Jonas was behind her and she could feel the quality of his stillness, which was the kind that meant he was working very hard at being casual. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." Cassian Cole nodded once, like a man who has filed a fact away in a reliable place. "Saturday morning, then. I will meet you at the trailhead at 7. He left, and Jonas turned to her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite getting there. "He is a good man," Jonas said after a moment. "You know him well?" Elara asked. "Well enough," Jonas said. "He has been coming into this store for 3 years. He does not say much, but what he says is true, and a man who keeps his word in this country is worth knowing." He paused. "He is also the only man in the San Juan Mountains attempting to grow an apple orchard at this elevation, which tells you something about his character." "What does it tell you?" Elara asked. "That when he decides something is worth doing," Jonas said, "he does not stop." Saturday morning was cool and bright and smelled of pine and new grass, and Elara was at the trailhead at 5 minutes to 7 in her best walking boots with her hair braided back from her face, and Cassian Cole was already there, leaning against a pine tree with the ease of a man who has never in his life been anywhere he did not intend to be. He was wearing his usual work clothes, and his hair was loose to his collar, and he had an axe on his belt that he carried the way other men carried pocket knives, without thought, as a natural extension of himself. He looked at her when she came up the trail, and something in his eyes shifted in a way she was beginning to recognize. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said, and straightened up from the tree. "The walk is about an hour. Is that all right?" "I walk up to the ridge twice a week," she said. "I know," he said. "I've seen you." He said it so plainly, without embarrassment or pretense, that she felt warmth climb her throat. "Come on, then." He walked slightly ahead of her on the narrow parts of the trail, and beside her on the wide parts, And he was an easy person to walk with because he did not feel the need to fill silence with noise, which Elara respected enormously. They talked about the mountain, about what herbs she had been gathering and why, about the water table on the north slope and what it meant for anything trying to grow there, and she found that he had a depth of knowledge about the natural world that was precise and unshowy, the kind that comes from years of direct, patient observation. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked when they were winding up through a stand of aspen. 4 years and some months, he said. "I came from Tennessee originally. Came west with a trapping outfit, worked for them for a year and a half, decided I preferred my own company." He paused. "Not all company," he added, and glanced at her sideways in a way that was brief and loaded, and then looked back at the trail. "What made you choose here?" she asked. "The San Juan specifically." "A man I met in Taos told me there was no finer mountain country in the world," Cassian said. He was right. He was quiet for a moment. "Also the light. The quality of the light at this altitude in the mornings. I had never seen anything like it." She looked at his profile and thought that she had not expected him to say something like that, and then thought that perhaps she should have. Because a man who planted apple trees on a mountain because he decided they ought to grow, there was clearly a man who saw the world in terms of what was possible rather than what was probable. And people like that tended to notice the light. They came out of the tree line onto a south-facing slope that had been cleared of brush, and Elara stopped walking. The orchard was not yet what it would become. The trees were small, barely more than saplings, most of them between 2 and 3 feet high, their slender trunks held upright by careful stakes and cordage. They were planted in rows that ran across the slope, following the contour of the land, and each tree had been mounded at the base with soil and mulch, and small channels ran between the rows to carry water down from the creek that came off the higher ground above. The whole thing had been built with obvious care and tremendous labor. The channels alone must have taken weeks to cut, and the trees themselves stood in the mountain light with the particular quality of things that have survived something hard and are still standing. But there were buds on them, small and tight and pale green, but unmistakably there, on nearly every one of the 42 remaining trees. Elara walked forward slowly, as though she might disturb them, and she stopped beside the nearest tree and looked at the buds and felt something happen behind her sternum that was too large for the moment and yet entirely appropriate to it. "They are budding," she said. "Yes." Cassian Cole had stopped a few feet behind her and was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and careful at once, like a man who has carried something quietly for a long time and is not entirely sure what happens when he sets it down. "This is extraordinary," she said. She touched one of the small green buds very gently with one finger. 42 trees. 42, he confirmed. She turned to look at him. "You did all of this yourself?" "Yes. The channels, the staking, the mounding, all of it. There was no one else to do it," he said simply. She looked at him standing in the morning light among the rows of small budding trees, and something came into very clear focus inside her that she had been circling for months, and she thought, with the clarity of certainty, that she was in a great deal of trouble. "Why apple trees?" she asked, because she needed to ask it and was not yet ready to ask the thing underneath it. He held her gaze. "I heard someone mention, in November, that they would give a great deal for a single apple tree." The world was very quiet. The wind moved through the pines above them, and the creek made its constant soft sound, and the morning light fell across the budding rows of trees and across Cassian Cole's face, and she could not breathe quite right. "I said that to my Uncle Jonas," she said very carefully, "on the porch of the store. I was bringing furs to trade," he said. "I came around the back of the building. I was not eavesdropping, but I heard." He paused. "And I thought, if someone wanted something that badly, and the only obstacle was that nobody had tried hard enough to make it possible, then the problem was not the thing. The problem was the effort." Elara looked at him for a long, full moment, and she felt something crack open in her chest in the best possible way, like ground in the spring when the frost finally gives. "Cassian," she said. "I know it is early," he said. "I know we have only talked a handful of times. I'm not asking anything. I just thought you should see them. I thought you should know. You planted an orchard, she said, for me, because I wanted to bake apple pie. He met her eyes without flinching. I planted an orchard because it needed to be done and nobody had done it, he said. And yes, because of you. She walked toward him, 3 steps across the mountain ground, and he went very still in the way large, powerful things go still when they are uncertain, like a mountain lion sitting in a tree or a river at the moment before it drops over a falls. And she stopped in front of him and looked up at him and said, "Thank you." He looked down at her and the almost smile was there, fuller this time, a real smile that reached his eyes and changed his entire face into something that made her think of light coming through breaks in clouds. "You are welcome," he said. They walked back down the mountain together, slower this time, and talked about everything and nothing, about Tennessee and Missouri, about her parents and how she had come to Ridgecrest, about the town and the winter and the particular quality of Colorado summers. And by the time the trail leveled out near the base of the ridge, she felt that she knew him in the particular way you sometimes know people, where the knowing is not about facts so much as about something deeper and harder to name. He walked her back to the store and said goodbye at the door with a kind of careful formality that she found she liked enormously. And she went inside and sat down behind the counter, and Jonas looked at her from across the room and wisely said nothing at all. June in the San Juan Mountains was a revelation. The high meadows came up gold and purple with wildflowers, and the days were long and warm, and the sky was the particular deep blue that you only get at altitude, and the apple trees on the north slope continued to grow with a stubbornness that Elara had come to think of as almost personal. She went up to see them twice in June, once with Cassian, and once alone on a morning when she was up before the town and wanted to think without interruption, and she stood in the rows of small trees and felt the strange, specific peace of being somewhere that had been made out of love. Because it had been made out of love, she was certain of that now. You did not plant 47 saplings up a mountain in January and cut irrigation channels out of frozen ground and spend the better part of 4 months in solitary labor over something you did not care about beyond all reason. People did not do things like that for practical purposes. They did them because they were driven by something that could not be talked into silence. She thought about this on the morning when she was alone in the orchard, and she thought about Cassian Cole sleeping in whatever shelter he had made for himself on the north face. And she thought about the fact that she was in love with him, and that she had been for longer than she had admitted, and that being in love with someone was deeply inconvenient, and also the most alive she had felt since Missouri. She was in this particular meditation when the sound of someone coming up the trail made her turn, and it was not Cassian, but Del Pruitt. He came up through the tree line with his hands in his pockets and a smile that made her skin prickle, and she straightened up and arranged herself carefully, because she had learned in her 22 years that the best response to a threat you could not name was to be very still and very composed and give nothing away. "Miss Holt," Del said, looking around at the orchard. "Well, he really did it. Heard rumors, but thought people were exaggerating." "What do you want, Mr. Pruitt?" she said. He walked along the nearest row, looking at the trees with a kind of evaluating attention she did not like. "Nice piece of slope," he said. "South-facing. Good sun exposure, worth something this land if the trees take." "Mr. Cole has a claim on this land," she said. "Does he?" Del smiled. "Filed it himself? At the land office in Durango?" She did not answer because she did not know the answer. "A lot of men up here working land they have not properly filed on," Del said. "A lot of confusion in the records. Easy for a claim to get challenged." He looked at her steadily. "You might mention to your friend that it would be a good idea to get his paperwork in order." She held his gaze. "I will mention it," she said, in a tone that said she understood exactly what was being communicated and was not going to give him the satisfaction of showing fear. "Is there anything else?" He looked at her for a long moment with that smile, and then shrugged and turned and walked back down the trail, and she stood in the orchard and breathed carefully for a moment before she turned and walked quickly up the trail toward Cassian Cole's camp. She found him half a mile further up the slope, splitting timber for a new fence line, and the sight of him working stopped her for a moment in a way she was used to by now, The particular evidence of his physical reality, the way he moved with the axe in an easy rhythm that made something that should have been brutally hard look like a natural extension of breathing. He had his coat off in the June warmth, and his shirt was rolled up, and she had a clear understanding of exactly how strong he was, and it was the kind of understanding that would have made her Aunt Charlotte fan herself and her mother quietly cheer. He heard her coming and set the axe down and turned, and when he saw her face, he came toward her without hesitation. "What happened?" he said. Not a question, a recognition. She told him about Del Pruitt and the land claim, and he listened with his jaw set and his eyes steady, and when she was done, he said, "How long ago?" 20 minutes, she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when he had made a decision. "I have a claim filed," he said. "I filed in Durango in February of 1870. The orchard land is within it." He paused. "Pruitt has been trying to get at the mining rights on the North Slope for a year. He has been using land challenges as leverage on other small claims." He looked at her. "You knew to come and tell me." "Of course I knew to come and tell you," she said. He looked at her with that open, careful expression, the one that meant something was close to the surface that he was managing. And he said, "How did you know where to find me?" "I've been here twice," she said. I remembered. A pause. "You remembered the way to my camp from 2 visits." "I remember things," she said, which was true and was also not entirely what she meant, and from the look in his eyes he understood exactly what she meant. "Elara," he said, and her name in his voice was a whole different word than it had ever been before, and he took one step toward her, and she took one step toward him, and she was suddenly very close to him, and looking up, and his hand came up to the side of her face with a gentleness that was completely at odds with and entirely consistent with everything she knew about him. Because, of course, a man who planted apple trees on a mountain, of course his hands were gentle. "I am not a man who does things halfway," he said. "You should know that before." "I know that," she said. "You planted 47 apple trees." 42, he said, and he was smiling now, the real smile again, the one that was like light through clouds, and she felt her whole chest fill up with something warm and sure. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if you are willing. If your uncle, my Uncle Jonas told me last month that you are a good man," she said. "I suspect he will manage." And then Cassian Cole kissed her, carefully and completely, with his large scarred hand still cupped against her face and the mountain breeze moving through the apple trees around them. And Elara felt, with absolute and total clarity, that this was where the rest of her life was beginning. There were things to be dealt with first, because love in the real world does not arrive without complications, and the San Juan Mountains in 1873 were as real a world as any that had ever existed. The first thing was Del Pruitt. Cassian rode down to Durango the following week with his claim papers in his coat, and came back with them properly witnessed and registered, and a letter from the land office that confirmed his right to the North Slope in terms that left no room for challenge. He brought the letter to Jonas at the store, and Jonas read it, and nodded with the satisfied expression of a man whose opinion has been confirmed. And then Cassian asked Jonas formally if he might call on Elara, and Jonas said yes with a handshake that lasted long enough to be significant. Del Pruitt made one more attempt 2 weeks later, when Cassian came down to town for supplies, and Pruitt met him in the street with Sayers beside him and said something in a low voice that Elara, watching from the store doorway, could not hear. What she could see was Cassian Cole looking at both men with a steadiness that was more intimidating than anger, the kind of stillness that told anyone with sense that the still thing was not still because it was harmless, but because it had chosen to be, and whatever Pruitt said was met with a response that was quiet and apparently complete, because Pruitt looked at Cassian for a long moment and then turned and walked away, and Sayers followed him, and they were gone from Ridgecrest within the month. The second thing was the practical reality of 2 lives that had been built separately, trying to understand how they fit together. Cassian began coming down from the mountain every Saturday and Sunday. He would arrive at the store on Saturday morning to help Jonas with whatever heavy work needed doing, repairing the porch, resetting a wall that had shifted, bringing in supply crates from the wagon, and then in the afternoon, he and Elara would walk or sit on the porch of Jonas's house, or, when it rained, sit inside with Jonas at the table and play cards, which Cassian turned out to be very good at, in a quiet, methodical way that suggested he had spent a lot of cold nights on a mountain making sure his mind stayed sharp. He was not a talkative man, but he was a present one, and Elara found that presence more sustaining than any amount of talk. He listened the way few people listen, fully, without preparing his response while she was still speaking, as though what she said mattered enough to receive entirely. And when he did speak, he said exactly what he meant without embellishment, which she trusted. She learned, over those Saturday and Sunday visits, that he had a brother back in Tennessee named Eli, 2 years younger, who was farming tobacco and had a wife and 2 children. That he had left home at 19 because the land there did not feel like his land and he had needed to find the thing that did. That he had trapped bear and beaver and elk for years and was good at it, but found that what he loved most was not the trapping but the observing, the patient, quiet watching of how things worked in wild places. That he had taught himself to read properly from a Bible he had traded for at a trading post in New Mexico, and that he had 3 books in his camp that he had read so many times the spines had given out. She told him about Missouri and her parents, and what it had been like to lose them both in the same month to typhoid, the particular specific weight of that grief, how it had felt like the ground disappearing from under her feet. He listened to all of it and said, when she was done, "That must have been a very lonely road west." "It was," she said, "but Jonas was kind." "And the store," he said, "and the baking." "And the baking," she agreed and smiled. "I want to taste it," he said. "When the trees fruit." She looked at him. "You planted an entire orchard and you have never tasted my pie." "No," he said, and the look he gave her was so warm and so steady that she felt it like sunlight. "But I intend to." The summer moved on, and the apple trees grew, and Elara went up to the orchard often, sometimes with Cassian and sometimes alone. She learned to read the trees the way he taught her, the color of new leaves, the way buds developed, what healthy bark looked like versus bark that was struggling. He taught her these things with the same patience and precision with which he did everything, standing beside her in the rows, and she would watch his hands as he pointed things out, and thought about that first day in the store when she had noticed his hands on the counter and felt the specific satisfaction of a person who knows that their life is moving in the right direction. One Sunday afternoon in late July, they sat on a rock above the orchard looking down at the rows of trees, more fully leafed out now, taller, rooted in what was clearly going to be a life, and Cassian said, without preamble, "I have been thinking about building." She waited. "The camp is adequate for 1 person," he said. "It is not adequate for 2, and I do not want to wait until after I have asked you something before I start building, because I think that would be backward. I think the house should be there when I ask, so you can see what I am proposing." She was quiet for a moment. The valley was spread below them, and the mountains rose on every side, and the light was gold and low, and the apple trees stood in their rows in the afternoon. "What are you proposing?" she said quietly. He turned to look at her with those dark eyes that she had come to love the way you love a particular quality of the light, specifically, irreplaceably, as a constant in the world. "Everything," he said simply. "I am proposing everything." She breathed. "Then build your house, Cassian Cole," she said, "and ask me when it is done." He began building in August. He built in the way he did everything, systematically, without waste of effort or material, and with a thoroughness that meant every piece of the structure was done correctly the first time. He felled his own timber from the slopes above the orchard site, and he hewed his own planks, and he set his own foundation stones, and he framed a cabin that was, by Ridgecrest standards, generous, 2 rooms proper, and a front porch and a separate structure attached to the back that was clearly designed as a kitchen, with a big fireplace and built-in shelving and a wide working surface of sanded wood. Jonas went up with Elara to see it in early September, when the framing was done and the roof was going on, and Jonas stood with his thumbs in his belt loops and looked at it for a long time, and then said very quietly, "That's a house built by a man who intends to stay." Cassian was on the roof when they arrived, and he climbed down and shook Jonas's hand and showed him through the structure, and Jonas asked good questions about the foundation and the drainage and the winter insulation, and Cassian answered all of them with the quiet confidence of a man who has thought through every contingency. Elara walked through the kitchen space and stood at the wide working surface and ran her hands along the smooth wood and thought about bread dough and pie crust and the smell of cinnamon, and she thought about her mother's hands. The roof was on by the end of September, and the walls were chinked and the fireplace was drawing cleanly, and it was done. Cassian came to the store on the first Saturday of October and asked Jonas if he might speak with Elara alone, and Jonas went for a very thorough walk, and Cassian stood in the store and looked at her and said, "Come up to the house with me." She went. The October morning was cool and brilliant, the aspens all turned to gold on the hillsides, and the cabin on the north slope sat in the light with the orchard below it and the mountains above it, and smoke already going in the chimney. Because he had come up early and built a fire before he came to get her, because of course he had. He walked her through every room without speaking and let her look. And she looked at everything. At the windows he had set to face south to catch the winter light, at the wide shelves in the main room for books, at the hook by the door exactly the right height for her coat, at the kitchen with its big fireplace and its wide working surface, and the shelf he had built specifically for spice tins, and its view out the south window toward the orchard. She stood at that kitchen window and looked at the orchard for a long time. The leaves were beginning to turn. The trees had grown all summer with the stubbornness they had demonstrated from the beginning, and some of them were taller than she was now, and they were beautiful in the autumn light. Cassian came to stand behind her, and she turned around, and he was right there, and he reached into his coat pocket and took out something small and held it out to her. It was a ring, a plain gold band with a small red stone that caught the light, and she recognized it as a garnet, the deep blood-red kind that came from the mountains of Colorado. "I found the stone in the creek last spring," he said. "I had it set by the jeweler in Durango 3 months ago." He paused. "I have been carrying it since August." "August," she said. "I wanted to wait until the house was done," he said. "I told you I would." She looked up at him in the kitchen of the house he had built, with the orchard outside the window that he had planted, and she thought about November of 1872, sitting on the porch with Jonas and saying she would give a great deal for a single apple tree, and she thought about how extraordinary it was, the way some words go further than you ever intend them to. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger, and his hands were as gentle as they had been on the mountain in June, and she put her hands flat against his chest, and he put his arms around her, carefully and then less carefully, and she felt the full solid reality of him, the warmth and the strength and the enormous deliberate heart of him, and she thought, "This is the person I will grow old with," and it felt true in the way only a few things in a life ever feel completely true. They were married in November of 1873, a year almost to the month after Elara had sat on Jonas's porch and wished for an apple tree. The ceremony was in the Ridgecrest church, small and simple and full of everyone the town contained, and Bess Whitmore cried through the whole thing, and her husband Robert stood next to Cassian and looked proud in the way that men look when they are in the presence of something they consider correct. Jonas walked Elara down the aisle and squeezed her hand at the front, and she had the impression that her mother would have approved of everything, which was the specific benediction she needed most. Cassian wore a clean dark coat, and his hair was brushed back from his face, and he was the best-looking man in any room he walked into without seeming to know it, which she had decided was part of the reason she loved him. He said his vows in his low, unhurried voice, and held her eyes the entire time as though there was nothing else in the room worth looking at, and she said hers back to him and meant every syllable down to the marrow. The celebration afterward was at Jonas's house, and there was whiskey and fiddle music and enough food for twice the number of people present, and Elara danced with Jonas and with Robert Whitmore and with old Tom Aldrich, who danced badly and enthusiastically and had clearly started on the whiskey early, and then Cassian took her hand and turned her toward him, and she danced with her husband for the first time, and he was, as she might have predicted from everything she knew about him, steady and sure and exactly as good at it as the effort deserved. They rode up to the mountain cabin that night in the cold November dark, and Cassian had come up the day before to lay in wood and provision the kitchen, and there was a fire going, and the cabin was warm, and she stood in the kitchen of her own home for the first time and felt the particular, enormous quiet of a life settling into its right shape. Winter came again, the second winter of the orchard, and the trees went dormant under the snow with the ease of things that have survived one hard season and know they can survive another. Cassian tended them even in the cold, checking for damage, reinforcing the stakes against the heavy snow load, clearing ice from the channels. And Elara would sometimes put on her coat and walk out into the white morning and stand among the sleeping trees and talk to him while he worked. And he would answer from wherever he was in the rows without stopping what he was doing. And she would stand in the cold with her breath making small clouds and feel entirely, completely at home. She taught her reading lessons on Tuesdays and worked in Jonas's store on Wednesdays and Thursdays. And Cassian would come with her on those days and do whatever the store needed doing and talk to Jonas about the orchard's progress and drink coffee at the counter with the ease of a man who has found his place in the world and has no need to perform it. The townspeople who had been uncertain about him at first had come around in the way that people do when they see someone consistently be who they say they are, and by that first married winter, he was not the strange, solitary man on the mountain, but simply Cassian Cole, who knew more about the San Juan wilderness than anyone and would help you fix your fence if you asked, and had put an entire orchard on the north slope for his wife, which everyone considered both romantic and admirable. Spring of 1874 came, and the orchard woke up, and this time the buds were thicker and more confident, and by June there were flowers, white and delicate and fragrant, filling the whole slope with a sweetness that carried down to the tree line. And Elara stood in the flowering rows and felt something so full and right that it was almost too large to hold. "They are blooming," she said, to no one, and to Cassian, and to her mother, and to every year of wanting, and to the mountain itself. "They are blooming," Cassian said from the end of the row, watching her with the expression she had come to love most, the open, steady, full one, the one that said everything without saying a word. There were no apples in the summer of 1874. "The first year of flowering is about establishing the tree," Cassian told her, "and the fruit, when it came, would be better for the wait." She accepted this with equanimity, because she had learned that things worth having were worth waiting for, which was a lesson the orchard itself had taught her in the most direct way possible. Summer of 1874 brought other things. Bess and Robert Whitmore's baby learned to walk and became an immediate authority on chaos. Jonas hired a young man from the valley to help in the store 3 days a week, and found, to his transparent delight, that he had time to play chess at the saloon on Thursday afternoons. A family named Hargrove came up from the valley and settled a claim on the south slope, and had 3 children and a dairy cow, and added something warm to the town's eastern edge. And in August of 1874, Elara realized that she was going to have a child. She told Cassian on a Tuesday evening when he came in from the orchard, standing in the kitchen with her hands floury from bread making and her heart very full, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and she watched the news move through his face in sequence, understanding, then something that went too deep for a name, then the real smile, the one like light through clouds, but larger than she had ever seen it, so large it transformed the whole geometry of his face into something that made her breath catch. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and gathered her up with a care and strength that she thought described him perfectly, and she put her flower-covered hands against his shoulders and felt him breathing. "A child," he said, against her hair. "A child," she confirmed. He pulled back and looked at her face with his hands still on her shoulders, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, a brightness that was not its usual directness, but something warmer and more naked. "I was alone on this mountain for 4 years, he said. "And now?" He seemed to not have a word for the end of that sentence, and she thought that was correct, that there was not a word that could finish it adequately. "Now," she agreed. He went to tell Jonas that same evening and came back reporting that Jonas had immediately begun planning a cradle from a piece of walnut he had been saving in the back of the store for 3 years without knowing what for, which Elara found entirely characteristic of Jonas and deeply moving. The pregnancy was unremarkable in the best way. She was healthy and strong, and the mountain air and her own practical nature conspired to make the months move forward with a minimum of drama. The orchard bloomed again in the spring of 1875, and this time, in June, the first small hard green apples appeared on 18 of the 42 trees, and Elara stood in the rows and looked at them with her hand resting on the swell of her stomach and felt a specific and extraordinary gratitude. "They are coming," she said. "Both of them," Cassian said, and he was looking at her, not the trees. Their son was born in July of 1875 on a hot mountain afternoon, with Bess Whitmore serving as midwife and Jonas pacing the porch with the concentration of a general, and Cassian sitting with Elara's hand in his for the entire labor with the same calm and present strength he brought to everything. And Elara, in the exhausted, clarified aftermath, thought that of all the things she knew about him, this was the one she would carry deepest. They named him Samuel Jonas Cole. Samuel for Cassian's father, Jonas for her uncle, and Cole because there was already one of those on the mountain, and now there would be two. Samuel was red-faced and loud, and had Cassian's dark eyes and what would become, clearly, a great deal of hair, and Cassian held him with the careful, absolute attention he brought to the apple trees and the irrigation channels, and every other thing he had decided mattered. And Elara watched from the bed and thought about the word everything, how Cassian had said it in October of 1872 on a rock above the orchard, "I am proposing everything," and felt that it had arrived. It was all here. It was enormous and ordinary and completely present, and she was more grateful than she had language to contain. The apples ripened in September of 1875. Not all of the trees bore fruit that first year. 23 of the 42 produced a harvest, and the harvest was modest, perhaps 4 bushels all told, but they were real and red and round, and they had grown on a mountain at 8,000 feet where everyone had said nothing could grow. And when Cassian brought the first basket down to the cabin and set it on the kitchen table, Elara stood over it for a full minute without speaking. She picked one up. It was firm and cool and smelled exactly the way apples were supposed to smell, the clean, sharp sweetness of them, and she closed her eyes. "They smell like Missouri," she said. Cassian was quiet behind her. She opened her eyes. "They smell like my mother's kitchen," she said. "Exactly like it." She made 4 pies that afternoon with Samuel sleeping in the cradle that Jonas had built, which was sanded smooth and finished with a care that Jonas had clearly enjoyed tremendously. She made the crusts from lard and cold water and flour the way her mother had taught her, pressing carefully, and she peeled and sliced the apples and mixed in cinnamon and brown sugar. The same cinnamon and brown sugar that Cassian had bought at her counter in February of 1873, she thought, and almost laughed out loud, and she crimped the edges and put them in the oven, and the smell that filled the cabin was so precisely and so overwhelmingly home that she had to stop for a moment and stand at the kitchen window and breathe through the feeling. She could see the orchard from the window, the trees in their rows, their leaves beginning to turn, the mountain rising above them. She thought about the man she had seen on the ridge in January of 1873, silhouetted against the white sky, hauling saplings up a mountain because someone had said they wanted an apple tree. She thought about the way some gestures are so large and so quiet that you do not know what to do with them except try to be worthy of them. Cassian came in from outside and stopped in the doorway, and the smell of the pies reached him, and he stood there for a moment with his coat half off and his expression completely unguarded, which was, she had found, the rarest and most precious version of him. "It smells extraordinary in here," he said. "Come and sit down," she told him. "You have earned this more than anyone alive." He sat, and she brought him a slice while it was still warm, the crust golden and the apples softened under the cinnamon and sugar, and she watched him take the first bite and watched his face, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he looked at her and said, "That is the best thing I have ever tasted." "It is the best batch I have ever made," she said, and she believed it. "The apples are better than the ones from the valley. They are sweeter." "Cold nights," he said. "Altitude. Stress makes them concentrate their sugar." He took another bite. Also, they were grown with considerably more effort than valley apples. She laughed and sat across from him with her own slice, and they ate together in the kitchen of the cabin on the north slope, with the orchard outside the window, and Samuel making small sleeping sounds in his cradle. And the late September light came through the window and lay across the table between them, and she thought this was a scene she would remember for the rest of her life, exactly as it was, exactly in this light. That evening they carried the other 3 pies down to town. One for Jonas, one for Bess and Robert and the children, one for Mrs. Farnsworth, the schoolteacher, who had given Elara her friendship and her Tuesday afternoons without ever asking for anything back. Jonas ate his at his kitchen table with the kind of satisfaction that is both about the pie and about something much larger than the pie, and Bess held her slice in both hands and declared it the finest thing she had tasted in Colorado, which Elara suspected was generous, but accepted with warm gratitude. They walked back up the mountain in the dark with Samuel bundled against Elara's chest and Cassian carrying the empty pie tins, and the stars were extraordinary above the San Juans, the high, crisp, almost painful stars of a clear Colorado autumn night. And she leaned against Cassian's shoulder as they walked, and he put his arm around her, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet, the full and easy quiet of 2 people who do not need to fill the space between them with anything, because the space itself is good. "How many trees do you think will bear next year?" she asked. "All of them," he said, without hesitation. 38 at minimum, maybe all 42. "All 42, she said. "They are good trees," he said. "They just needed time." She smiled into the cold dark. "Like most things worth having." He tightened his arm around her briefly in response, which was, she had learned, his way of saying yes when yes was all that needed to be said. The years on the North Slope accumulated the way good years do, with weight and warmth and the specific richness of a life that is being genuinely lived. The winter of 1875 was hard and long, and they bore it together in the cabin, Cassian going out every morning to tend the horses and check the orchard and cut wood from the stores he had laid in during fall, Elara keeping the stove hot and teaching Samuel, who was not yet walking, but showed every sign of being a person with strong opinions, to recognize patterns and shapes and the difference between a juniper and a pine. Spring of 1876 came with the particular violence and joy of Colorado springs, and the orchard bloomed in April, and the blossoms were thick on every single tree, and the scent carried all the way down to the tree line on still mornings, and people from town began to find reasons to walk up the North Trail in late April just to see it. Cassian never said anything about these visitors, but he always made sure there was a clear path through the rows. And once Elara came out to find him pointing out something to old Mrs. Hargrove from the new family on the South Slope, explaining which blossoms would fruit and which would drop, with a patience and precision that told her, not for the first time, that the man she had married was considerably more gentle than the mountain he resembled. The harvest of 1876 was everything he had promised. 39 of the 42 trees bore fruit. 2 of the remaining 3 were young replacements he had put in for trees lost to disease, and the third was simply stubborn, which he noted without rancor as its right. The harvest came to somewhere near 40 bushels, which was more apples than Elara could reasonably use in pies, and so she canned the remainder and made apple butter and dried slices on wooden racks in the autumn sun. And the cabin on the North Slope smelled of cinnamon and preserves for 3 weeks, and she thought she had never been so entirely and uncomplicated happy. She made a pie every week through the apple season, and she never once baked one without thinking of her mother. She had written her mother's recipe down in a small ledger the same year she came to Ridgecrest, preserving it the way you preserve something you cannot afford to lose, and she kept the ledger in the kitchen beside the spice tins, and sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would take it out and read through the measurements in her mother's round handwriting, and Cassian would see her do this and say nothing and simply be there, which was the right and only thing. In the spring of 1877, Elara realized she was pregnant again. This time she told Cassian in the orchard, on a morning when the blossoms were just beginning to open and the whole slope smelled of sweetness, and he turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the same as it had been the first time, that deep, unguarded brightness, and he took her face in his hands with enormous care. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she said. Samuel, who was nearly 2 and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's tenacity and a distinct personal agenda that he pursued at all times regardless of everyone else's opinion, was sitting at the end of the row eating an early apple he had retrieved from somewhere with the efficiency of a small person who knew his own mind, and he looked at his parents with the evaluating calm of a child who is accustomed to adults doing things he does not yet understand. Good, Samuel announced about the apple and went back to eating. Their daughter was born in December of 1877 in the first big snow of the season, with the wind coming down off the mountain and the cabin warm against it, and Cassian holding Elara's hand with the same steady, immovable presence as always. They named her Clara May Cole. Clara for Elara's mother, May for the month the orchard first bloomed in the year they married, which Cassian had suggested, and which made Elara love him so precisely and so completely that she had to laugh to release some of it. Clara was small and dark-haired and quiet in the first weeks, watching the world with serious eyes that held, already, a quality of patient attention that was unmistakably her father's. Samuel regarded his sister with cautious scientific interest for exactly 1 week before deciding she was acceptable and appointing himself her chief protector, which was a role he took on with the seriousness of a person twice his age, and which was, Elara thought, the most purely Cassian thing she had ever seen Samuel do. The orchard grew. Every spring it bloomed, white and sweet and impossible, on the mountain where everyone had said nothing would grow. Cassian replaced trees as they aged or failed and planted new ones in the gaps, and by 1879 the orchard stood at 50 trees, 3 more than he had started with, which pleased him in a quiet way that she found entirely characteristic. He never lost the attentive daily care with which he tended the trees, and she sometimes watched him moving through the rows in the early morning light, stopping here and there to check a branch or clear a channel. And she thought about January of 1873, and the silhouette on the ridge, and the 50 saplings in the mountain, and how some decisions, made quietly and alone in the cold, changed the entire shape of a life. The children grew with the orchard. Samuel, who had his father's physical capacity and his mother's analytical mind, was helping with real work by the time he was 7, carrying water, stacking pruned branches, learning to read the trees the way Cassian had taught Elara to read them. Clara, who was 3 years younger and had her mother's dark hair and her own entirely original combination of quietness and will, could identify every variety of apple tree on the slope by the time she was 5 by the shape of the leaf and the pattern of the bark, and she told everyone she was going to be a botanist, which made Cassian smile with a pride so large it barely fit inside his face. Elara taught her reading lessons every Tuesday through those years and baked every Saturday and picked apples every autumn and watched her children grow tall in the mountain air and lay beside her husband in the dark winter nights and talked about everything and nothing, and she thought that this was what a life should feel like, specific and present and larger than you had imagined, and yet exactly the size it needed to be. In the fall of 1880, Jonas sold the dry goods store and retired. He was 63, and his knees had decided they were done with Colorado winters, and he was going to his sister in Santa Fe, where the winters were moderate, and the chess was, he claimed, of a higher quality. Elara cried when he told her, and he patted her hand and said that she was the best thing that had ever come into his store, including the time a man traded him a Navajo blanket for a bag of flour, and he got the better end of the deal, which was so much Jonas that she laughed through her tears. He came up to the cabin for a last dinner before he left, and Elara made an apple pie from the new harvest, and Jonas ate 2 slices and said it was the finest pie he had tasted in his life, and that her mother would have been proud, and Elara held his hands at the door when he left and said, "You saved my life. You know that." "You saved your own life," Jonas said. "I just opened the store in the morning." Cassian shook his hand for a long time at the bottom of the trail, and Jonas said something quiet to him that Elara did not hear, and Cassian nodded once, and she thought she knew what Jonas had said. She thought he had said, "Take care of her," and she thought Cassian's nod had said, "I know, I will, I already am," and she was right on all 3 counts. Life in Ridgecrest changed in the early 1880s the way all things change, incrementally and then suddenly. The railroad reached the lower valley in 1882, which meant goods arrived more regularly, and the supply wagons ran more often, and the town grew by 1/3 in 2 years. New families came in from the east and the south, and there was talk of a proper school building and a courthouse, and all the apparatus of a town deciding it was serious about itself. Elara watched this growth with the mixed feelings of a woman who had lived through what the town was and had views about what it should become, and and she became, over those years, one of its more vocal citizens at the town meetings, not because she was seeking that role, but because she had things to say and had learned not to wait for permission to say them. She spoke up about the treatment of the Ute people whose land this had been, and who were being pushed further and further from the mountains they had lived in for generations. And this was not a popular thing to say at the town meetings in 1882, but she said it with clarity and without apology. And Cassian, sitting beside her with Samuel on his other side, said nothing during the meeting, and on the walk home put his arm around her and said, "You said exactly what was right." "Nobody liked it," she said. "That does not change what is right," he said. She already knew this, but she appreciated that he said it. She also organized a collection for a woman named Rosa Reyes, who had come to Ridgecrest from New Mexico with her children after her husband died on the road, and who had found, in Ridgecrest, the particular unkindness that some small western towns offered to women who did not fit the expected pattern. Elara went to see Rosa the week she arrived and brought her a pie and stayed for 2 hours and listened, and then she went around the town and collected what she could and made sure Rosa knew that at least some part of Ridgecrest intended to behave like human beings. Rosa stayed, eventually opened a dressmaking business, and became one of Elara's closest friends, and her daughter Maria became Clara Cole's best friend, which was an outcome that pleased everyone enormously, and Elara considered one of the better things she had accomplished. The fall of 1882 was the best harvest the orchard had ever given them. Every tree bore fruit, and the fruit was abundant, and the apple butter Elara put up that year filled 30 jars on the kitchen shelves, and the dried rings of apple hung from the ceiling beams, and the smell of the cabin in September was a smell she knew she would never forget in her life. She made 12 pies that week, which was excessive and deliberate, and she distributed them through the town, to Bess and Robert, to Rosa and Maria, to Mrs. Farnsworth, who had retired from teaching but lived still in her small house by the schoolhouse, to the new schoolteacher and his family, to the Hargroves, to half a dozen other families. And she walked around Ridgecrest in the autumn light with a basket on her arm and felt the specific physical joy of having something to give. When she got home that evening, Cassian was sitting on the front porch of the cabin in the golden September late light, with his feet up on the railing, and Samuel beside him doing the same. And Clara was somewhere in the orchard. Elara could hear her narrating something to herself in the serious tone she used when she was conducting scientific observation. Cassian looked at her when she came up the trail with the empty basket, and he had the full, unguarded expression, the one she loved most. "All distributed?" he said. "Every last one," she said, and climbed the porch steps and sat in her chair beside his. They looked at the orchard together for a while in the evening quiet. The trees were heavy with the last of the harvest, and the leaves were beginning to turn, and the mountain rose above them, gold and dark green and enormous. And somewhere in the rows Clara was still conducting her investigation. "Cassian," Elara said. "Yes. Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," he said, without taking his eyes off the orchard. "That evening in November of 1872, she said, when I told Jonas I would give a great deal for a single apple tree. I said it to be heard by no one. I did not know anyone was listening." He was quiet for a moment. "I was bringing furs," he said. "I'd come around the back of the building because the front door was blocked by the supply wagon." "I know," she said. "I know the whole story." She paused. "I just think about it sometimes, how close it was to not happening. If the wagon had not been there, if I had said it on a different evening." He turned to look at her, and his face in the September light was the face she knew better than any other face in the world, the weathered, strong, quiet face that had given her the almost smile, and then the real smile, and had looked at her in the orchard on a January cold February morning, and in the kitchen of the unfinished house on the north slope, and in the low light of 1,000 ordinary evenings. "It would have happened," he said. "You do not know that." "I know it," he said, with the absolute, unhurried certainty that was one of the truest things about him. "Because I would have found out sooner or later what you wanted, and I would have done it sooner or later. The apple trees are proof of that, not the beginning of it." He held her gaze. "You are the person I was looking for when I came up this mountain. I would have found you eventually." She looked at him for a long moment and felt the full, irreducible weight of loving someone well. "That's the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," she said. I'm not a romantic man, he said. You planted 47 apple trees on the side of a mountain because I mentioned once that I wanted one, she said. You are the most romantic man I have ever known. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to it, a low, brief, warm sound that she heard only rarely and treasured accordingly. 47 was the most they had at the nursery in Durango, he said. Cassian, she said. Elara, he said. I love you, she said. He took her hand on the arm of the chair and held it with the careful, complete attention he had always given to everything that mattered, and he said, I love you. And it was as unhurried and as direct and as true as everything else he had ever said to her, and the mountain held them on its side as it had held the orchard and the cabin and their children and their years, and the evening came down gold over the San Juans. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. In the years that followed, the orchard became part of what Ridgecrest was, the way certain things become inseparable from the places that made them possible. People talked about the Cole orchard the way they talked about the mountains themselves, as something that had always been there, which was both wrong and somehow right, because it had certainly always been meant to be there, even if it had taken one very particular man, with very particular hands and a very particular quality of determined, quiet love to understand that. Elara's pies became something of a legend in the region. She did not seek this. She simply baked them every apple season with the apples from the orchard her husband had planted and the recipe from the ledger her mother had written in, pressing the lard into the flour with hands that grew more practiced every year, and she gave them to the people around her without calculation, because that was what her mother had done, and it was what she understood generosity to mean. But word travels in small mountain towns, and by the mid-1880s there were people who came up from the lower valley specifically to buy jars of her apple butter, and she obliged them because it seemed unkind not to. Samuel grew into a young man with his father's build and his mother's gift for language and a talent for drawing that seemed to have arrived from somewhere specific in the gene pool without a clear precedent. And at 16, he was sketching maps of the mountain trails with a precision that the county surveyor, passing through in 1891, declared professional quality. He went to Denver at 18 to study engineering, with his parents' blessing and a basket of dried apple rings and his mother's apple butter for the journey. And he wrote letters home every week without fail that were thorough and funny and full of observations about the world that reminded Elara, in the best way, of walking through an orchard with someone who notices every tree. Clara stayed on the mountain. She studied botany through correspondence courses and through the library that had been established in Ridgecrest's new building in 1887, and through a passionate, self-directed program of reading and observation that made her the most knowledgeable person in the region on the subject of high-altitude plant life. She published a paper in 1893 in an agricultural journal about apple cultivation at elevation, citing her father's orchard as the practical foundation of its findings, and Cassian read it at the kitchen table with an expression that was profoundly characteristic, very still and very full. She is remarkable, he said, setting the journal down. She is your daughter, Elara said. She is yours, he said. She is both, Elara said, which is why she is who she is. He looked at her and smiled, the full real smile, as available now as it had always been rare then, worn into ease by 20 years of being given space to exist. And she smiled back and thought about a man on a ridge in the white January sky, carrying saplings up a mountain, and about how the best things in a life are the ones that looked, at first, like they had nothing to do with anything. In the spring of 1894, they planted 5 new trees in the orchard, a ceremony that had become a kind of annual tradition, the replacing of trees that had run their course with young ones that would carry the orchard forward into the years that came after. Clara selected the varieties with careful deliberation, and Cassian dug the holes, and Elara set the roots and pressed the soil around them, and they worked together in the April morning with the blossoms on the older trees open above them and the mountain light coming down clear and cold and gold. Clara wrote the variety names in her small, precise handwriting on wooden stakes and drove them in beside each new tree, and Cassian stood at the end of the row and looked at the whole orchard, 53 trees now, more than he had ever started with, more than he had imagined starting with on that January morning 21 years ago when he had carried the first saplings up the ridge, and his face held the quiet, specific satisfaction of a man whose life has turned out to be exactly what it ought to be. Elara came to stand beside him. She was 44 years old, and the dark hair had threads of silver in it, and she was, he thought, more beautiful than she had been at 22 in the way that people become more beautiful when they have lived their lives with honesty and generosity, when the face reflects the interior accurately. "More trees than you started with," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you proud of that?" He looked at the orchard for a long moment and then at her. "I'm proud of everything I see from here," he said, and she knew he did not mean only the trees. She knew he meant the cabin behind them and the mountain above them, and the years between the first cold morning and this warm spring one, and the daughter writing careful labels in the new ground, and the son far away in Denver writing letters home every week, and the life they had made together on the side of a mountain where nothing was supposed to grow. She took his hand and he held it, and they stood in the orchard in the spring light, and somewhere in the rows Clara began to sing something under her breath, an old song Elara had taught her from Missouri, and the apple trees bloomed all around them, white and sweet and entirely impossible, entirely present, exactly as they had been every spring for 20 years on the north face of the San Juan Mountains, standing their beautiful and stubborn ground. That evening, Elara made a pie. She always made a pie on the evening of the spring planting. She had made one every year since 1875, when the orchard first bore fruit, a ritual that needed no explanation because the meaning was in the doing of it. The rolling of the crust, the measuring of the cinnamon, the brown sugar mixing with the sliced apples in the bowl, the smell of it rising from the oven to fill every corner of the cabin with the particular warmth that was both completely present and completely remembered, both here on the mountain and back in Missouri in her mother's kitchen, both now and then, both the beginning and the long, rich, living middle of everything. Cassian came in from outside while it was baking and stopped in the doorway as he always did, taking in the smell with an expression she had watched settle into him over 20 years, from the deeply moved to the deeply at home, which were not the same thing and were also exactly the same thing. He sat at the table, and Clara sat across from him, and Elara brought the pie out and set it between them and sat in her own chair, and the mountain light came through the south kitchen window and lay across the table between them, and the orchard stood outside in the late April gold, and they ate together in the cabin on the north slope, and there was nowhere on earth to be better than here, and they all knew it, and the knowing of it was its own kind of grace. When the pie was done and the plates were cleared and Clara had gone to write in her botanical journals and Cassian had gone out to close up the barn for the night, Elara stood at the kitchen window and looked at the orchard in the dusk, the rows of trees going dark against the lighter sky, the mountain rising behind them, massive and patient and permanent. She thought about the word she had used that night on Jonas's porch 21 years ago. Give. She would give a great deal for a single apple tree. She thought about what had happened in answer to that word. Not one tree, but 53. Not given, but built, planted in frozen ground and tended through hard winters and nurtured through dry summers, built stone by stone and channel by channel and year by year, by a man who had heard her wish and taken it seriously in the most absolute and literal way a wish had ever been taken. She thought about what it meant that the first thing he had ever done for her was not a small gesture, but the largest one he could imagine. She thought about how a man like that, once he decided you were worth the whole mountain, did not give you less than the whole mountain. She heard his step on the porch, and the door opened, and he came in with the smell of the cold evening on him, and he stopped behind her at the window and looked out at the orchard with her. "All 53, he said. "All 53, she said. His arms came around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, against the solid reality of him, and they stood at the kitchen window of their home on the north slope of the San Juan Mountains, and looked out at the apple orchard that had started everything, and the stars came out one by one over the peaks, and the night was full and still and perfectly, completely their own.